Joining us now to discuss what we can expect is Admiral Mark Montgomery with the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. Mark, good to see you.
Well, thank you for having me.
Of course. So let's just set the stage here for our viewers ahead of this meeting later on today. It was just last Friday that President Trump met with Russian President Vladimir Putin. What came of that summit? How did it go overall?
Look, I'm not as pessimistic on the summit as some are. The idea of Putin on U.S. soil was a concession. I think flying a B-2 over him took a little of the icing off that cake. And then probably most importantly, two things happened. One, President Trump didn't make any concessions on behalf of Ukraine, which weren't his to make. But more, more tellingly, and one that'll be a problem, is President Putin has not signaled any concessions he's willing to do. He has never done that. He has had the same talking points since the beginning of this illegal invasion in 2022, and he's maintained them through. So I don't think we're any closer to a cessation of hostilities, whether it's a ceasefire or a comprehensive deal, than we were before that meeting. Now, that may change after today's meeting between President Trump and President Zelenskyy and other European leaders.
All right, so I'm glad that you brought that up. I think it's important to kind of outline what these goals that Putin has when it came to that invasion of Ukraine. If you can just give us maybe a synopsis of what is it that he is really trying to accomplish with this war.
Look, long term, he wants to pull Ukraine and, for that matter, Belarus back into a greater Russia. I mean, that is his true long-term goal. That's why he launched the invasion and stopped his gray zone warfare in 2022. Once he's experienced the defeat on the battlefield, he's been attempting to get more limited gains, which are the four eastern provinces of Ukraine, and of which he now has, 100%, almost 100% of Luhansk and 70+% of the other three. And obviously to maintain Crimea. And that's so his entering point right now is Ukraine should cede the land, the 70% of each of the other three provinces, and the remaining 0.5% of Luhansk. He already has 100% of Crimea. So he has 100% of all five of those provinces of eastern Ukraine. And so, from my perspective, that's his number one goal at this point.
And that brings us back to where the Ukrainian president is standing today. Now, he has also remained firm that he's not going to give in to any of these requirements that President Putin has when it comes to ending this war. So really, where does Zelenskyy stand at this point, especially because he was not included in that summit between President Trump and President Putin?
Yeah, so that's a great point. I should mention Putin's second goal is no NATO agreement, no really significant security guarantees for Ukraine. So that gets to Zelensky's two major points. One, he does not want to surrender any more land than he's already lost, and very specifically the fortification network that he has in the Donetsk province, which really is the kind of the firewall against future Russian aggression. So he wants to hold the 30% of Donetsk province, and he wants to begin to get security guarantees that if he enters into a ceasefire or long-term peace deal, that he has guarantees from Europe and the United States that we will step in and protect him. And they have to be stronger than the 1994 Budapest Agreement security guarantees, which we did not follow. What we and the Europeans failed to truly adhere to protect Ukraine if they were invaded by another power, which obviously was Russia. So my point on this, he needs security guarantees, and he needs to not give up that last piece of land. He may have to acknowledge the loss of 19% of his country, at least for now.
Something that President Trump has been saying since that meeting with President Putin is that the ball is in Zelensky's court today, whether we reach that peace deal or, we come to some sort of ceasefire agreement. But realistically, what would that entail, whether it's either side giving something up in this war or being able to retain what it is that they want?
Yeah, here's some place where I think the president's misspeaking. The ball is not in Ukraine's court. They have conceded major points. Russia has conceded nothing. Putin has conceded nothing. The ball is actually in President Trump's court. He needs to actually apply a maximum pressure campaign against Putin. He needs to come out of this meeting saying, look, I had the same guarantees, the same concessions I had from Ukraine since late February. I now need President Putin to move to the middle. And to facilitate that, I'm going to either do a mixture of sanctions on the secondary receivers of the shadow fleet, oil and natural gas from Russia. I'm going to allow Ukraine and Europe to purchase offensive weapon systems from the United States. And I'm going to improve the defensive weapon systems flow from U.S. Inventory or U.S. Defense Industrial Base to Ukraine, paid for by Europe. My point on this is the maximum pressure campaign needs to be on Putin, not Zelenskyy. Zelensky's already made concessions. Putin's done nothing.
We just have a post here from Fox News on X saying Trump says Zelenskyy can end Russia war, quote, almost immediately before hosting 7 European leaders. Let's break down a little bit the relationship that President Trump has, though, with President Putin, given everything that we saw on Friday. How has that developed throughout the last several months, especially given the fact that when President Trump was running his campaign before heading into the Oval Office, he did vow to end this war almost immediately? That has not happened yet.
I think President Trump's one-day claim was always rhetorical, as many of the things he says are. But I think he really believed he could get it done in 100 days. And he was wrong. And he was wrong for one reason: Vladimir Putin. I think President Trump continually gives Putin the benefit of the doubt, which in hindsight is a mistake. President Putin is an authoritarian. He's a stone-cold killer. He invaded Ukraine without cause. And we're now in this position. I think we're at the point where the world's most powerful man, Donald Trump, needs to hold the world's most, the worst acting out authoritarian in the world, President Putin. Trump needs to hold Putin accountable, and you do that with sanctions and offensive weapons.
We can learn a lot from history. If we look back at how President Putin has kind of run during his time there in Russia, how has he handled similar situations in the past? What can we glean from that when we look to getting towards some sort of solution to this specific conflict?
Well, look, President Trump can be the first American president to really solve the riddle of Vladimir Putin. George W. Bush said he could look into his eyes and tell he was an okay guy. President Obama's Secretary of State Hillary Clinton said she could hit a reset button. President Biden was always worried about provoking President Putin, so he limited how weapon systems were transferred to Ukraine. We're now in a position where someone needs to finally hold President Putin accountable, and that person is President Trump. He has all the tools to do it. He's given President Putin more than enough time to come around. And I think this last meeting in Alaska was a great opportunity for President Putin to give some concessions. He gave none. I think that's why the press conference was so short and why there were no questions, was President Trump was disappointed in Putin. But this idea that Zelenskyy can end this conflict is not correct. Zelenskyy can only end the conflict by sacrificing Ukraine's future, and no president is going to do that.
We're just taking a look here at some of the footage from Friday and that press conference that was hosted by President Trump and President Putin after their meeting. I also want to talk a little bit about the other leaders that are going to be present during the meeting later on today. So just a few of them here on your screen. There's more, but that includes French President Emmanuel Macron. We also have the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, who just yesterday held a press conference with Zelenskyy. We'll also have NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte. Okay, where do all of these leaders come into play when it comes to these talks between Trump, Zelenskyy, and ultimately the war that is between Ukraine and Russia?
Well, look, I think for the purposes of the military conflict, four leaders matter. Most importantly, Macron and the leader of France, and Keir Starmer, the leader of the UK. They're the two that are most likely going to provide significant forces as part of any kind of reassurance force that goes into Ukraine after a peace deal. So those two are the most important countries. And then I'd say the Chancellor of Germany is important because he'll fund a lot of Ukrainian military recoupment. And then finally, Secretary Rutte, the leader of NATO, who's been fantastic in getting NATO in alignment with Trump's vision of how Europe should support itself. he'll be important because NATO will backstop some of this reassurance, not with Article 5 guarantees, but with the logistics and intelligence that's necessary. And I think the United States will be a big part of that. So of those leaders, those are 5 big players in there. I think the European Union leader is about the economic recovery of Ukraine once we have a cessation of hostilities. That's when she'll come in, or the European Union will come in as the most important asset.
And then while these talks are still going on, Mark, the fighting continues down there on the grounds. I want to put up this post on X from President Zelenskyy. I'm not going to read it in full. It's quite lengthy, but he details a little bit about what's going on there on the ground. The first couple of lines saying this was a demonstrative and cynical Russian strike. They are aware that a meeting is taking place today in Washington that will address the end of the war. So can you break down for us what's happening at this moment in that combat zone?
Sure. There's two areas of combat, really. There's a line of contact in the Donetsk region where there have been some minor Russian breakthroughs. They've also been pushed, defeated and cut off by the Ukrainians. So I think we're back to, will Russia gain a square kilometer here and there? You bet. Are they gaining the kind of critical territory necessary to have a significant change in the war? Not yet. So Ukraine is holding its own there, but not from lack of Russia sacrificing literally tens of thousands of soldiers to gain square kilometers of land. What President Zelenskyy is also referring to are the cruise and ballistic missile and drone attacks that are incessant. They're daily and they add up weekly to more than, for example, were ever launched by Iran against Israel. And you can get all of that combat in 1 week in Ukraine from the Russian side. And that's where the lack of defensive munitions, because of the slowdown in U.S. deliveries, has really affected the Ukrainians. We need to give them access to buy that, and the Europeans to buy it from a defense industrial base. And the recent decision by the Department of Defense to possibly hold back weapons that were going to be delivered under the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative is disastrous and completely misunderstands the state of the battlefield.
And then, Mark, just bringing us back out to this live image that we have right outside of the White House. It's noon today that we are expecting for everyone to be convening there in Washington, D.C. I don't necessarily want to ask the question in terms of best case scenario, worst case scenario, because I think that we can pretty much come up with that answer on our own. But if we thought about best case scenario, at least something realistic when it comes to these talks today, to that possible peace deal, the possible ceasefire, what is that likelihood? How optimistic are you based on someone that is really studying this timeline of events here?
Well, so first, I hope it starts with President Zelenskyy saying thank you, and then Vice President Vance can relax a little bit. And then after that, they can get into a good discussion. I think there's a reasonable discussion of what security guarantees look like. This is an important step. These are the men and women who will provide the security guarantee, mostly European, but with some U.S. probably intelligence and logistics and targeting support. But these are the people who provide the troops and the wherewithal to do that. And then there has to be a discussion of the land and what is the final line of the demilitarized zone you draw this across. And I think at that point the Europeans have to convince the president of the necessity of maintaining the current line of control in the conflict. If those two things can be dealt with, what is the final, from the U.S. and Ukrainian position of what is the appropriate amount of land that you acknowledge Russia holds, which is, I think, no more than they've already captured. And what do the security guarantees look like? If we can get those two things together, that's a highly successful meeting, a much more successful meeting than Alaska, and no need to fly a B-2 over everybody.
And then, Mark, I really do want to get your final thoughts here, because as our eyes are on this meeting and also the summit that happened Friday, there's a lot of things that go on behind the scenes and a lot of, reporting headlines that come out of this that maybe have been missed along the way throughout these really high profile events. Is there anything you feel that you would have to add to our viewers to give them more context, or something that they should keep in mind when trying to digest all of this that we are learning within the last several days and then looking ahead today?
Well, I'd say there's an opportunity here for President Trump. We know that he feels possibly accurately that he deserves to be considered for a Nobel Peace Prize. And if he were to actually resolve this war on terms that are reasonable to the victim, Ukraine, and you add that to his work in Azerbaijan, Armenia, you add that to his work in Thailand, Cambodia, you add that to his work in India, Pakistan, and in the Republic of Congo, Rwanda, it becomes a body of work. But that only gets done if he handles Ukraine, Russia appropriately and puts the aggressor, Vladimir Putin, in his place. Only then is he going to swing the kind of votes to get a well-earned Nobel Peace Prize.
Admiral Mark Montgomery with the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. We do appreciate your time on this Monday as we look ahead to this major meeting between President Trump, President Zelenskyy, several European leaders. We appreciate your time, and we'll be checking in soon.
Thank you.